stronger case to file as as an accomplice? You would say that Root is an accomplice to the involuntary manslaughter of the truck driver by his friend who was racing?
Then why isn't he an accomplice in the racer's own death?
Because he can't be, because I think it's different because if there's not an intervening, it's hard to say, sorry.
Go ahead. I love where you're going, because that leads me right where I want to go. Keep going. No pressure.
I think the intervening cause doesn't really exist in the second circumstance because it's a direct, the individual who killed the truck driver would have been the driver number 2, right, who died.
Yeah.
2, but there's no intervening cause that stops him or stops the chain of causation from him killing the truck driver.
One way to put what I think you're trying to say, Mr. Webb, is if you're going to hold Root as an accomplice in the truck driver's death, and that's the way to get around intervening cause, then you couldn't use that in the other driver's death because the driver can't be culpable for his own death. So you can't be, there's no potential for accomplice culpability, right? But the driver in the other car could be responsible if he lived for the truck driver's death, so that allows Root to be an accomplice. Well, I got a case for you. And this is a case that completely disagrees with Root, called State versus McFadden. And if you're interested in looking this up, again, you do not need to, but I'll just give you the citation so you can look it up because it's an interesting case. It's 320 Northwest 2nd, 608. And 320 Northwest 2nd, 608. State versus McFadden. And it's from Iowa, 1982. And in this case, I'll just sort of describe for you the facts. McFadden and Sulgrove were drag racing in Des Moines. Sulgrove, notice Sulgrove is not charged. This is important. Sulgrove loses control of his automobile and swerves into a lane of oncoming traffic. Very similar, right, to Root. And strikes a lawfully operated northbound vehicle. In that car was a 6-year-old passenger, Faith Ellis. She was killed along with Sulgrove. Okay? McFadden is charged with 2 counts, count them, 2, of involuntary manslaughter for the deaths of Sulgrove and 6-year-old, I'm going to drive that home, 6-year-old Faith Ellis. Okay? Under Mr. Webb's theory, if I understand him correctly, what should happen in terms of these convictions when they go up on appeal? Mr. Webb?
Thrown out.
Both of them?
No, you should charge the guy who's dead should be charged too, and you can charge the other guy as an accomplice as opposed to.
But in which death?
In the death of Ellis.
In the death of Ellis, but not of Sulgrove.
Yes.
Does that make any sense? Right? And because you're saying you drag raced, you engaged in the same dangerous conduct, and you're saying you can be culpable for the consequences of that crash, even though there was somebody else did something that was irrational and stupid beyond just the drag racing itself, which is irrational and stupid and reckless, right? Even though the other person did this extra stupid thing, you can still be culpable, but only for one when isolate out a strand based on the fact that we can construct an accomplice culpability theory based on being the accomplice of somebody who's dead and can't be charged. Well, here's what the Iowa court said. There were 3 theories, actually, under which McFadden could be liable. One is aiding and abetting. Aiding and abetting in Sulgrove's commission of involuntary manslaughter, but that only gets you Ellis's death, as Mr. Webb has told us. Second, McFadden was vicariously responsible for Sulgrove's commission because he jointly participated in the crime of drag racing. Same answer. That only gets you Ellis's death. The third theory was that McFadden himself committed the crime of involuntary manslaughter by recklessly engaging in drag racing, and that proximately caused, well, you don't have to rely on Sulgrove. McFadden himself engaged in conduct which recklessly caused and proximately caused the death of both. Okay? The Iowa Supreme Court said the third. It was enough to proximately cause the death even of Sulgrove, the other drag racer, who represents the decedent in Root also, that if you participate in the reckless activity, any actions by your fellow drag racers are not an intervening cause. And the court took note of Root about, well, this is too expansive for criminal culpability, and said, we do not agree. Proximate cause is based on the concept of foreseeability. We believe that the foreseeability requirement, coupled with the requirement of recklessness, will prevent the possibility of harsh or unjust results in involuntary manslaughter cases. So what does that mean? It means you have two courts which fundamentally reach differing conclusions on essentially the same facts. You could argue that it was the presence of the 6-year-old little girl which led the Iowa court to do whatever it needed to do to reach the result it thought just, and they looked less favorably on McFadden than the Pennsylvania court did on Root. Or you could argue they took a more emphasized foreseeability more and gave less weight to intervening cause, but they're just different results. So my question for you is, what do you think? Who's right? Pennsylvania or Iowa?
I think, kind of based on the train case, like the engineers made the situation that it was. I think that the Iowa case kind of reflects that same kind of standard.
Multiple causes.
Yeah, well, and that because the defendants created a scenario in which all of these other things could happen, they're liable. So I think that that's the case, and where the defendant should be liable for the death of his friend because he helped contribute to the situation it created.
Once you agree to drag race, it's foreseeable that some crash might happen. Maybe it will happen just because of the speed you're going. Maybe it will happen because of how this drag race unfolds. Because whatever it might happen is foreseeable, and if somebody dies, you have no complaint with the law, with we as a society holding you culpable. Ms. Richter, what do you think?
Well, what about the difference, though, of somebody choosing to participate in something that they know is going to be risky?
Yeah.
And so they get killed in the process. And yeah, both of them were engaged in something that was foreseeable, like that could lead to their death, but that's different than the train case where the train, the conductor, I mean, they didn't choose to enter into a dangerous situation. So, I mean, I don't know if there's an argument there or not. Does it matter that
Well, you
in
could
one
argue
case,
that lifting up tracks is dangerous if you don't do it right, I guess. But I think what you're suggesting, if I understand you correctly, is that this holding Root culpable is a better case than holding Benji culpable, because this was dangerous, they entered into it, and it was a foreseeable consequence.
well, actually, I was thinking because they never did say the person's name that died.
Do we want to give the person a name to make things easier?
Sure, but I
We'll go with Clapp.
which what?
We'll go with Clapp.
Clad?
Clapp.
Clat? Okay.
I couldn't get the last letter either.
Clat chose to participate.
Have you ever drag race?
No, I have not.
Or not that you're willing to admit.
No.
Right. Never incriminate yourself in criminal conduct. Very good.
Clat chose to participate in something that he knew was inherently dangerous.
Okay.
So, and they both did.
Right.
So, that's different. And so he ended up getting killed. Okay. I mean, that's sort of his own fault.
It's his own fault.
Yeah, it's his own fault. And then
So Root,
passenger.
Root, at least in terms of culpability for Clapp's death,
Yeah.
walks.
I mean, I think that it's different than killing a passenger who.
In terms of causation,
Yeah.
it's different from a passenger? Or is it just, there's some sense of what's just,
Yeah, that.
but
I don't know
not
if
really,
there's an
causation
argument.
can't really explain it? Clemens?
Yeah, I actually see the two drag racing cases as different because in Root, the driver chose to go into the other lane for traffic. In McFadden, you said the driver lost control. So in McFadden, it's like, well, either driver could have lost control because they were drag racing and caused the same incident. So,
Either driver could have swerved en route.
but that's a choice, and this one
It's
is
a
not.
choice.
So, like, I feel like there is a difference
In terms of when you start drag racing, if we're gonna ask the foreseeability question, I would ask you, is it not foreseeable, are not both of those potentially foreseeable actions that could happen because of the nature of drag racing? That is, it's foreseeable that somebody might lose control at high speeds under conditions that weren't made for those high speeds. And it's foreseeable that somebody might do something even by choice that's dangerous. So in terms of the foreseeability issue, does that distinction really work? Now, it may be that we're more willing to give intervening cause status to choices, and we'll see that in Stevenson. But does it work in terms of foreseeability?
only if you like really stretched it to argue that within drag racing there's levels of risk. So there's like just the instant we're gonna race, and then there's the we're gonna race and choose to pass into oncoming traffic.
I'm gonna
You could
guess,
argue
and again,
levels. Like, I don't think it's strong, but
yeah, I wonder if drag racers like have a set of rules before they start drag racing. Well, you know, you might lose control, and that's the risk we're taking, but you better not go into oncoming traffic intentionally. I just don't think, it's like, yeah, do what you need to do to win, and we'll, you know, that's the dare, that's the risk, that's the sort of the thrill of the danger that they're seeking, I think. Yeah.
Well, with regards to foreseeability, I feel like, so had there been $100,000 on the line or $1 million on the line, it would have been foreseeable for the person drag racing to understand like the dangers. But if there's like ego on the line, I don't feel like it's just very clear that another person can swerve on oncoming traffic, and it's that clear. That's why I feel like it's such a huge stretch for let's say if I was the drag racer to know that the other person I'm drag racing would just go on opposite traffic. Mainly because that's something I would never do, even if I was drag racing. Had there been $1 million on the line, though, maybe. And that's the point. Had there been, like, at least that's my point, like, if it's foreseeable as if there's, like, a huge...
They say everyone has a price. So now we know yours.
I was going to say then, so if we can argue both ways pretty evenly, or, well, in some states evenly, in some states no, that foreseeability could go either way in terms of where the foreseeability began. You then have to argue about direct cause, or find a more like, wouldn't the argument that would win be the one that can more closely find a direct cause or a causal relationship between them?
Do you think there's not that drag racing was not a direct cause of these crashes and deaths?
No, I think there's more of a direct cause in the case of Root rather than in the case of State versus McFadden.
You think there's more of a direct cause?
Well, more that you could argue, because there's more of a direct cause in the voluntariness of the voluntary action that took place in Root rather than the
Well, I
involuntary.
think the defense argument in both cases is simply that the direct cause was the actions of the dead person, either losing control or choosing to swerve into oncoming traffic. And that was the direct cause that breaks the chain of causation, rendering the decision to drag race, which is earlier back in the chain, not proximate, or to put it another way, not direct enough, right? So that the prosecution's argument is, as in Benji, there can be multiple causes. The fact that something comes later is not by itself make it intervening. We'll see that also in Stevenson, right? The fact that something comes later does not alone make it intervening, because there's almost, at least in a lot of crimes, there are things that come in between approximate cause that we wouldn't say were intervening just because they came later on. That would mean that only John Wilkes Booth's firing the shot could ever be proximate, right? Because anything back here wouldn't be, because there's always something new in between. So not everything that comes in between is intervening. The prosecution has the argument that it was intervening, the actions of the dead drivers, and the prosecution has an argument that it was not intervening, that all you needed was the drag racing, and that's sufficient. And we see that because two courts, one court buys it and one court doesn't, and the defense has the opposite. Yeah.
Do you know whether or not there's a difference in in Pennsylvania and Iowa, if they have felony murder or not? Like,
I'm sorry?
Do either one of the states that we're talking about, do either one of them have felony murder? Because I feel like that's kind of related.
Why would a felony murder charge be problematic here in either state? How much do you know about felony murder?
Unless street racing was a felony.
Exactly. The
But-
problem would be, it's probably pretty likely that the underlying crimes that you would try to use as a bootstrap to use felony murder aren't felonies.
But could that be like a reason, like if the Iowa state does have felony murder, could that kind of support their reasoning behind causation compared to whether or not Pennsylvania had it?
Well, at the time each of these two cases were decided, I would almost guarantee you, certainly the Pennsylvania case did have felony murder. Most states now have gotten away from felony murder, but at the time, the McFadden case was 81, I think, and when was Root? Even earlier than that, right?
61.
61. So that Iowa, I'm sure, had felony murder in 1961. Why would you think that would be a connection between the existence of felony murder and the way the court decided Root?
Because if they have felony murder, then they're kind of saying that creating a situation alone is enough in other cases.
Well, if I were the Iowa Supreme Court justice, I might write a concurrence, let's say I agreed with the decision, and say the existence of the felony murder rule supports this because the legislature, let's say it's this in the statute that there's felony murder, the legislature has said that causing danger with resultant death you should be culpable for that death only if it's an underlying felony. Now, there's a counter argument to that, which is they're not charging Root with murder, but only manslaughter. So it's, okay, there's an underlying dangerous conduct, reckless conduct, and if it was a felony, it would be murder. Since it's less than a felony, it's only manslaughter. So there's a dissenter could argue that if I tried to rely on the felony murder statute. But that would be the way I would try to argue it, is that felony murder shows what the legislature thinks should be required before your dangerous conduct can be the basis for homicide culpability. Okay? How many people think Root was rightly decided? Hands up high if you think Root was rightly decided. Most. Well, here's a point I've taught it a little differently this year. I think it's been good. Usually I come out gangbusters arguing to you that Root was terrible. That's what I've done in the past. And that it was one of the most horrible decisions. And I get all this pushback. People are like, no, it's right, no, it's right, no, it's right. And you see, a lot of you think it was right. And the reason I have taught it that way in the past is because I want to make a point. And I'm just going to make the point without doing it that way this year. And that is that you have to be willing and able to stand up for the position you think is right, and in the future that you have to make to defend your client, even in the face of somebody with some sort of authority tells you is wrong, right? In this case, it's your professor who's like, no, this case is terribly decided. You have to be willing to push back. You can't be intimidated by disagreement. Because if you are, what are you going to do when you get a judge who is giving you a hard time when you try to make an argument for your client? You know, you have to be respectful. You have to be professional about it, but you have to say, with all due respect, Your Honor, we think that's not the case, and here's why. We think that case was rightly decided, and you should follow it because if you just wilt in the face of some pressure, there's going to be, maybe there'll be occasions when you don't get it. There's going to be plenty of occasions when you do, and you have to be willing and able to stick to your guns, and don't let the fact that one of your faculty, including me, boy, my colleagues are going to be really mad at me for this, but any of us, don't let the fact that we may be sort of pushing a position about an issue or a case or a doctrine sort of automatically lead you to agree, right? We will respect you, and we certainly should, for making good arguments for positions that we disagree with, right? And Root is a really good example of that. I haven't quite approached it in the same way this year, but I want to make that point. I want to take this opportunity to make that point.
This might be kind of a stretch, but kind of like leading into the next case.
Uh-huh.
Argue, this might be not a great argument, but could you argue that the act of drag racing caused, like, Root's act of drag racing caused the mental state of the decedent to, like,
I'd have to have a lot more facts.
Okay.
That's, maybe there was coercion involved, or, if somehow the fact was that Root said, I've kidnapped your parents, and if you don't win this race, I will instruct my, my henchmen to kill them, right? Then Klatt is in a position of, I need to swerve, I can't lose, my parents' lives are at stake. Right, so you have to introduce some sort of coercion element as to that led to the decision, so it was involuntary. On anything we know on the facts, he just wanted to win. Maybe there was $1 million on the line, or you said 100,000. You made it. You became cut rate.
First I said 100,000, then I said $1 million. I thought it was more.
All right, right. It's just, an incentive as opposed to something that becomes not a choice. I think that's the line. Okay? Speaking of the next case, Stevenson, if you look in the footnote, at the beginning of the case, I believe, yes, on footnote 24, you will see some of the history of this that underlies this. That Stevenson was notorious as a leading figure in the KKK in Indiana when it was huge in Indiana in the 1920s. And this case changed the course of Indiana politics because it ended Stevenson's influence. It's quite interesting, sort of this other dimension to Stevenson's life. So what is it that ended up causing his downfall? What happened here?
So with the help of several other accomplices, he made a person who knew socially for several months. He repeatedly assaults, fights, and attempts to rape her.
And this is, as you say, after he had kidnapped her.
Yeah,
after he had abducted her.
Yeah.
So what happened? Is he charged with kidnapping or attempted rape? Is that his charge here that we're concerned about?
No, he's charged for second-degree murder because.
And how did that come about?
She secretly obtains bichloride with mercury.
And we'll talk later about the sequence of events that led to her obtaining that poison. But she did. She obtained it. And what then happened after she took this stuff?
She became violently ill, and Stevenson discovers that she took it. So he asked her if she wanted to go to the hospital.
So Stevenson says, and think about if you're Stevenson's defense lawyer, think about all of the parts of this case, the facts of this case from which you could build a defense. Okay? And I want to highlight that one as one. Right? He says, do you want to go to a hospital? What does she say?
She says no.
She says no. Then what does he do?
So he decides to take her back home, like back to her home in Indianapolis.
He decides to take her back home to her parents. Okay? And he does. Right? And what happens when she gets home?
They treat her bite wounds and replacement. However, her wounds did heal, but after 10 days she dies.
Right, one of the wounds becomes infected, that contributes to her death. And what does the doctor attribute death to?
A combination of shock, loss of food, loss of rest, the effect of the poison, and lack of early treatment, and the general impact of what had happened.
Now, it's not in your excerpt, but the decision also says that the doctor said that none of these factors taken alone would have been sufficient to result in death. Sounds a lot like Martin Dios, right? All this combination of factors, but we can't say any one would have caused her death. It's also not in your excerpt. The first count of the indictment charges Stevenson with murder based on kidnapping, rape, and wounding Oberholzer, leading to her taking the poison, and then is having neither administered an antidote nor calling for medical help after being able to do so. The jury convicts of second-degree murder. And the court here, the Indiana Supreme Court, affirms. Okay? What's the weakest part of the prosecution's case?
I mean, Stevenson argues that essentially it was more of a suicide attempt.
And what facts besides the fact that he offered to take her to the hospital? We've already isolated that fact. What other facts support this idea that it was suicide?
I mean, she left the hotel and purchased the poison herself in the night.
Did anyone when she went to the hotel, was Stevenson with her, making sure she didn't try to escape? Did and when she came back
alone.
and she came back voluntarily, as
Yeah.
far as appears, or at least on the surface appears. And where was she, or what were the circumstances under which she took the poison?
She's in a enjoyable room.
And did Stevenson know she was taking this? Did he encourage her to take this? And he wasn't even there, okay? So from all of these facts, the defense says, look, she killed herself. The act of taking poison was an intervening cause. Even if you make the supposition, the leap, Stevenson says, even if you make the leap that the actions he took were proximate in the sense that it was foreseeable, etc., that it was not merely a but-for, that the kidnapping, the attempted rape, that they spurred her. And without him doing those things, she would never have taken the poison. So you get that much causation. But she taking the poison is an intervening cause, and like the decedent drag racer in Root, you can't hold the defendant culpable for the actions of the person who died. They did it to themselves. Same or similar, at least, argument. Okay? His acts, because of an intervening responsible agent, cannot be the approximate cause. Why does the court reject that argument?
Isn't it because it was just kind of the amount of stress and the mental state that she was in, essentially?
Sadly, plenty of people dealing with mental illness or under stress or depression take, steps to suicide, and we don't hold somebody else culpable for them. What is it about her condition that is different from those other tragedies?
I mean, she was abducted, there was attempted rape, she was bit multiple times.
You phrase all of that in the passive voice. She was abducted. She was bit. Give me it in the active voice.
Or like she is being like.
No, what would be the active voice construction of that?
Well, actually, I'm not sure about that. I was just saying he's got complete control, right? Didn't
He
it say
did
that?
it, right?
Yeah.
Stevenson abducted her. That's active voice.
Oh, okay.
He who did something, not what was done to. He did those things, and thus it was not voluntary on her part, right? Here's a rule for you, right? Here's an actual rule for you. Ordinarily, voluntary human actions constitute intervening causes. Right? Voluntary human actions. So the actions of Oberholzer, under that rule, would ordinarily be an intervening cause, letting somebody else, in this case Stevenson, off the hook. But if those actions are both not voluntary and attributable to the defendant, they do not intervene. So here, her actions, the jury could have found, were not voluntary under these circumstances, that coercive force existed, even though he was not in the room at the time because he created the conditions. She was never alone. His bodyguard was always with her, right? She was intimidated, etc., right? And it was attributable to Stevenson. So there you have the conditions for the exception to that rule. Not voluntary, attributable to the defendant, so we will not treat it as intervening.
And both those conditions have to be met in order for it to not be intervening.
Well, ordinarily, right? You'll get weird facts in which courts do weird things, but yes, that's the rule. Okay? And there are facts to support this. She had tried to escape and been caught, creates this, creates a mindset in her that she has no choice. She tried to make phone calls. Those had been unsuccessful. And she was always accompanied, even when she went to the store, right? So her actions could be attributable to the very misconduct in which Stevenson engaged and for which he's being charged. So remember we did actus reus? And we said to count as an actus reus, it had to be voluntary, that if the police dragged you out onto the street, remember that? The police dragged you out onto the street, it wasn't your act. Here, that same idea appears. If it's not your act, then you can't say it's an intervening cause. And here, it supports that, okay? She was, as the court puts it on 324, subjected to the passion, desire, and will of the appellant. And her actions were a natural and probable consequence of his actions towards her. It's all one transaction, like drag racing, right? Like drag racing. If you're going to support the argument of McFadden, or the court's result in McFadden, you would say that too is all one transaction. And that's enough. Okay? But this is an even easier case because of the non-voluntariness required, or element. Questions about Stevenson? Anything else? Well, we get to break early today. We are done. I will see you on Wednesday.